Good evening. I'm Dr. Joseph J. Sweeney, Superintendent of Schools in East Brunswick. Welcome to Spotlight on Education. This is the second of our shows. On our last show last month, I talked with Russell Walker, who's the president of the Board of Education in East Brunswick. And he talked about his experiences as the board president and his goals and objectives and some of the things that he would like to accomplish as the president, and some of the things, in fact, that he had accomplished. Today, we have Dr. Robert Bonja, who's a coordinator of science K-12 at East Brunswick. And tonight, we want to talk to Bob about elementary science and education also. Bob, when I became superintendent of schools, they had a dual control or a dual kind of program in the elementary school in science. One was called SKIS and the other was called S. And after talking to a number of people, I decided that, well, I would make a decision and change to one program as opposed to the other. I always forget, what the SKIS and what the S means. Could you explain what they mean and briefly what are the advantages of the SKIS program, the program that we eventually chose?
Sure. ESS is Elementary Science Study, and SKIS is Science Curriculum Improvement Study. And they're both designed for elementary schools. They're both designed for the first grade through the sixth grade. The difference between the two is that SKIS is a program that's oriented toward process, as is ESS, but SKIS gives more direction to the teacher. It kind of helps the teacher get through the various programs. The ESS program, on the other hand, is what we'd call open-ended. And what that means is that it provides a wealth of information, but in order to really carry it to its fullest extent, you have to be well versed in science. Most of the elementary teachers are not trained in science to the extent that would be required to really handle ESS efficiently. Therefore, the SKIS that we have and we've been working with is far more acceptable for us.
I remember, well, I guess when I interviewed you for your present job, that I had some difficulty because the whole notion of having an open-ended science program was very appealing to me, and I think maybe if I had some different kinds of choices with different variables, I would again pick it, but I did not. One of the advantages I think that SKIS had, and maybe you could explain this too, is that it had materials for the teachers that we didn't have in the other program, we didn't have before in elementary school. Period, any kind of program. How is it coming along? I mean, is it working now that I haven't been back to it in some time? How is it working?
I think it's moving along very well. What we initially did, I guess it goes back to November, is we had a series of workshops where all of the teachers who were involved in the teaching of SKIS in the elementary schools met and decided what parts of the program best fit the needs of our students and our staff. And as we went through the workshop, we came up with a series of checklists where teachers went through the material and then presented their ideas to the staff above and listened to the staff in the grade level below them as to what they were working with, what their needs were, what they felt were the most important parts of the SKIS program. Out of it, what's begun to evolve is a slight variation. SKIS in general is taught, I would say, intact, grades 1 through 3. Just the way it's set up is the way we teach it. What starts to happen in the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade is that the teachers there tend to have a little bit more in the way of science background. And the result is they tend to desire, and justifiably so want, a program that still uses the basic skills, still works with the idea of process, but goes into an orientation that is more adapted to the direct needs of our kids, of the kids in East Brunswick. And so what they've done is they've, working with myself and Janet Vogel and Don Popowski, who are two of the elementary teachers that have worked very closely with me over the last few months, we've developed a scope and sequence which centers around the two parts of SKIS, but add in those parts that essentially we're going to be developing, and we have developed locally to, again, work with the more direct needs of the kids.
Yeah, I think the next question I would ask you, is it adequate? Like, you're giving me an indication that somehow or another, almost similar to math, that we have the program, we seem to be moving ahead, and you got to add in things. And you said that that is necessary for the children in East Brunswick. What does that mean? Are they different, better, or slower, or what?
Well, I think that based on just the nature of the kid and the nature of the staff in the town, we tend to work in an area where we're willing to explore. By that I mean you take a collection of facts and you build on it. And what happens is the kids seem to be able to very quickly adapt to that technique. So that when we're working in grades 1, 2, and 3, for example, there you're working with a program in SCIS that builds on a series of steps that gradually improve the process. In other words, the idea is you take the fact and you take that fact and figure out exactly what it's dealing with, and then you explore with it. You expand it into a thought process. In other words, the learning that we're working with is a learning that's beyond the process of rote. It's a development of intellect. And the kids are able to handle that very, very well. And so when we get into the second half of our elementary program, things that are in the living portion of SCIS tend to keep in the realm of the container. In other words, it works in a spiral that keeps the living science in let's say, an aquarium. And what we're looking for is a way to get it out and get it into the environment.
I don't know whether I dare ask you the next question. How does it test out? How do we know? Like, if I were to ask you as a superintendent, was it coming along, and you said yes, and then you asked the question, answer the question whether it was adequate or not. Do we test it? How do we know that it's doing that well?
Okay.
Other than observation, I am.
Well, there are a lot of ways to do it. It varies dependent on the teacher. But if you work with SCIS, what you find is that you go through a collection of information. That information can be a glossary list. It could be a list of definitions, for example. And one of the simplest ways, but not necessarily the best way to test, would be to test to see whether a student knows that base level. The more sophisticated way of testing in SCIS is to have the kids go through the process of problem solving, of being able to work through a series of questions that actually cause them to reason, to analyze information. That's what I was talking about when I said the development of intellect. If you can get the kids to think beyond that fact, beyond that rote process, then you can get them to use any set of facts wherever they can find it, and then explore with it and develop.
Does the SCIS program, do they provide for that as a testing program of some type, or do we make it up our own, or do you have some testing program that you have?
At this point in time, we depend on the teacher's expertise in the learning steps. There are checkups that are in the text of the teacher's manual. And what it deals with there is it advises as to how you can go through a process to see whether a kid understands the things that you've been working with. There are dittos that essentially become the test. And what it does is it tries to design, as you go through each year, a little bit more sophisticated approach to reasoning the problem out.
You've had a lot of experience in science, I guess a lot of different grade levels. Is it possible that a youngster could pass the written text and not do very well, say, in the lab section and experimentation, and reverse? You've talked about that a little bit with me.
100%. I think that I would probably be the best example of an individual who does very poorly on the written portion of a test, but will do well in the exploration part, the problem-solving part. And the reverse is true. And that's why it's rather important to provide a balance. And SCIS seems to do that well enough, where you can use a little bit of both. Because then what you're doing is you're giving the opportunity to the kid to explore in the realm that they're not sure in, but succeed in the realm that they are sure in.
You use yourself as an example. Maybe you ought to know a lot about it, then not necessarily so, but is there some reason and style or personality that do you want to get in and do the work rather than study about it? I've heard some kids say that they don't want to study anymore, they want to do it.
Right. Well, that's it. You know, I think what you find is, for example, a lot of times, you know, I don't really understand it as it comes out of the book. I can't, if I read it, it doesn't make sense, but if I can mess around with it, if I could just work with my hands, I can see it better. And that in general is the way it works. You know, I think you could call it common sense sometimes too, where people just are able to problem solve by just seeing it and puzzling it, piecing it together. Very often that creates a much better product. And as I indicated, my experience, when I went back to do my research for a PhD, I felt like an alchemist many times because my knowledge of chemistry was way back, and I just couldn't function in the realm that was expected of me in the lecture. But when it came to the lab, I couldn't fail. I really could get into it because I could fool around with it.
What was your own experience in, say, elementary school, junior high, and high school? Mine was somewhat along the lines that science was book-oriented, and when I came here to this school system, as a matter of fact, I taught science in the junior high, and all we had was a book, and everything came out of a book, especially at the elementary grades. Beyond that, there was some kind of an experimentation, some equipment, but very little. Did you go through the same process or not?
It was much the same. The first experiments that I can recall actually were experiments that happened in my 8th grade class, and I think that actually is what spurred me on to work in science because the teacher got us going in things. She gave us the opportunity to explore, to work out an experiment and try to problem solve. It was not near as sophisticated as it is right now. I was thinking back the other day, the first microscope I ever handled, and this was in the 50s, was one made of brass, and the biology teacher let us take it out of the cabinet twice in 1 year, and that was the extent that we had as far as working with a microscope. Now we work with a microscope almost everywhere.
Yeah. There was a cartoonist and humorist named Thurber who seemed to have the same difficulty I had in school, that he said he looked through a microscope and generally the only thing he could see was his eyelid. But I want to get back to another thing that interests me about some of the things you said, and you touched upon it in one instance, and maybe I could fit it in here somewhere. People talk a great deal, and you people talk a great deal about process, and that annoys other people. And I remember years ago they had a workshop at high school in a different area in social studies, and some of the board members came, and I think Dr. Burnett at that time was the chairman of the social studies group that was working during the summer. And they were talking a great deal about process, and the board says, oh, we had enough of that. When did they learn the facts? When do your people learn the facts? Is it they just, you talk about the process and almost seems that anything happened.
Yeah.
Where do the facts come in?
Well, the facts come in first. As I had indicated, the way a person learns is to first experience the facts, the simple part of the world. That's often referred to as rote learning, and that's a very efficient way to learn in that you concentrate a lot in a very small period of time. The thing to put together is that very often when you learn a bunch of facts, it lasts for just a moment. When you're dealing with that topic, the facts make sense. But when you get beyond it, then they're forgotten. You know, the idea of you cram for an exam and you memorize the stuff and you perhaps work 8-10 hours. When I was in college, I remember doing that. And, you know, after you took the test, a couple hours later, you really began to forget most of what you had been dealing with. Well, the idea of process is to take a set of facts and use that or apply the information to an experiment, to a study, and get the kids to think what it means. And then the key, the real sophisticated part of it, is to have them being able to take that information, in other words, that technique, and then being able to take and transfer it to a realm or a level where the facts have not been the base. That becomes very sophisticated, and that's true intellect. And that's where we really want to try and head toward, not necessarily we're ever going to get there.
Well, sometimes in administrative courses, and I think that fortunately or unfortunately, I think it's unfortunate to some degree, and it seems to me that they reveal to me some sense of inferiority, that other kinds of academic areas take the scientific approach, and they get involved in process a great deal, but that's all that happens, and they make the statement that the process is a thing. It seems to me that real science ought to go beyond that, and I guess that's what you're saying.
You have to get beyond it. You have to be able to take and go through a procedure and be able to draw an answer, to draw a conclusion. That's the final step. And when you can do that, then the learning is really beginning to occur.
We sometimes have at the board level, and parents get up, and some of our own board members feel the same way, that it's absolutely necessary to have a book in science, or it's absolutely necessary to have a book, period. And I tend to agree with that to some extent. But you're famous, one of your famous saying is that, well, it depends, that you don't necessarily have it. And you did at Churchill a great deal of work where you created your own textbook. How did that work out for you?
Well, what we did is it wasn't that we didn't have textbooks. We had a textbook in the sense that we had a large number of texts, and they were used as a reference. And the idea is we work with the assumption that a student should always work with the book and have that as a base that was always readily available, but not a base that they were totally dependent on. In other words, get away from the idea of saying that the book becomes the Bible, because then when that happens, the only thing you learn is what the Bible says, what the book says. And what we're trying to do is to get them to take that book, that Bible, and interpret it, to go beyond it, to try and say, look, this is what the facts are, but this is what we can do with those facts if we build on it. And when you work with a series of texts where you literally don't have a single thing that you follow, then what happens is you can refer to the information, but then when you explore, you're exploring in a multi-directional facet. In other words, you're working on many different directions, many different avenues. The idea is then, if a child has a particular attitude, a particular pattern, you're not stifling them. You're not saying, no, you have to do it that way because that's the way the book says to do it. You're saying, look, we can learn, and we learn in many directions. And that's really what SCIS is doing for us. It's providing a base in the elementary schools that give the kids the options of thinking in many directions, not a definite yes-no answer. There's some maybes there, and of course life is full of maybes.
Do you think that that process, do you think it carries over to other areas? Would they use a scientific approach, maybe thinking about a social problem, or you hope it is?
I certainly hope so. That's really the goal. I think that if we can get the kids to work in the sciences where they're thinking a problem through, if we're successful, then we can have that extend. And of course, that's really the key to it all. You know, education tends to be taught as isolated disciplines, when in reality, life is a blend of it all. And that's what we're hoping we're doing. Science is the vehicle that perhaps we can blend things together while it's still in school.
Okay, just very quickly, we went through the whole elementary here. Again, getting back to, how do you feel? Do you feel comfortable about it? It's a good program? And
I think it's a good program. I think that what we've been able to do, and you know, I commend East Brunswick for doing it that way, is we are taking what is a solid program and we're exploring and expanding it. And we're working with the professionals that are in the school system. And you know, the most competent people, as far as I'm concerned, are the teachers, the ones who are really working with the kids in the classroom. And they're making the decisions. They're deciding what's the best avenue to go through. I think we're going to have something to really be proud of in the future.
Well, maybe your attitude that you express here is the feedback that I get because of that attitude is that when you go into schools, that the teachers say to me that you can teach teachers and you can also teach youngsters at any grade level. So maybe the attitude that you have just reinforces what they're saying. So since I've been a superintendent, what I've been trying to do in every year is go K-12 and reading and develop a unified school system, and that's getting to be tiresome and a cliche, but I'm still trying to do it. Just if we leave elementary for a quick moment, how does it look beyond that? Does it look as though the junior high and high school is coming along? You're the only person that has a real good view.
I think we've got a very solid base. when I was at Churchill, Hammersholt and Churchill, the staffs were working toward a program that started process in the 7th grade and built on it. And with SCIS being our base, we can now expand that. Our real goal is to get into a situation where in the junior highs, we're working with a direction that gets more and more into experimental problem solving, where the kids can literally start to think in the abstract. And I think we're on the way. Obviously, what that does is that opens up the high school to a true avenue where the kids can problem solve and can really think things through.
Starting with that background. We want to look at some film here. The people from the station here went around to school and took some pictures of some youngsters doing some sciencing, if you could call it that. And maybe you could comment on it as they roll the film for us. Okay.
When SCIS starts, it starts in the 1st grade, obviously, and what you're seeing now is a lesson dealing with the idea of serial ordering. Now, in the 1st grade, you're going to find that there's a great need for teacher direction. The kids are not really sure as to how to proceed, and so it's spelled out. You can see that the terms examine, compare, and there are suggestions for the kids to work with. Things dealing with, well, if you're going to put things in an order, what might you use as a guide? And then the next step is to then get the kids to respond to those suggestions, to those teacher suggestions. They're very willing to do that. They like to work with things where they have the freedom to make decisions. It's a case where they feel that their opportunity to be an individual is being fully appreciated. And you can see the teacher still has to help a little. Some kids can immediately start to go through the process. Other kids need a little bit of assurance. But they're all capable of doing it, and they get very excited with it. Sometimes you get very tired and frustrated, too.
He looks a little excited there. He's huffing and puffing, isn't he?
He's working at it. And, you know, there's a couple ideas that go with it. It's not a case where, you know, I'm doing it and it's my idea. You share things. You work together with it. And that's, of course, what happens in real life, too. You really problem solve as a joint effort. But you can really get to see. I don't know whether you experienced that, but that child's really thinking about it and really trying to come up with an answer.
You know, with this, did we identify the grade? This is grade 1?
This is grade 1.
And that's Mrs. Apollo's class? I thought I recognized her.
Right. And, you know, there are a lot of ways that you can put things in an order. You can work with the shells on one way, or you can put them upside down. You can work with color. So the combinations actually are endless. Important in follow-through, as you see, we're back to the idea of the teacher leading the discussion.
Do they give them credit for that, if they put it in different ways, if they have their own individual way to put the order?
Sure, as long as it's in order. And in an order, that's a valid process. Now, in the 5th grade, it's a little bit more sophisticated. The teacher direction is there, but the teacher direction is far more subtle. It's more of direction of here's the material. These are some of the things that we're working with. The process is suggested. You can see, we still go through an organization. There's still a statement of what we're to do and a definition of the direction. It's teacher carried out, at least at that stage in the game. Now, when you get down further, you see, you have a situation where the kids are now offering the alternatives. They're making decisions before the experiment is being done. And what they're really doing is they're giving the experiment the variables. The materials are passed out. The point here is that the teacher direction drops way down because the kids are now expected to perform the tasks as individuals, actually as groups. And you can watch and see how they set it up. There are some difficulties in it, and that's okay.
What exactly are they doing now?
Okay, what they're doing is they're taking and transferring energy from the ball. They're using the ramp as the place where they're getting the energy and transferring it to something that rolls, that moves. So it's a transfer of from one object to another. And they're trying to measure how much of the energy is transferred. Now, you can see there are a lot of mistakes, but that's not bad. That's good. For example, there, the tape got in the way. Now,
see that.
you know, whoop, there goes the ball. So, you know, it's okay, because that's all the parts that are involved in someone thinking something through. And you can see, okay, it worked right. They realize it, and now what they do is they take and they collect their data. And you'll notice they're collecting their data by, in this case, just simply measuring the distance that the object moved.
Well, that's very interesting. Let me ask you a question, I guess, which is sort of global in nature, that I found in education that what happens in science to a great extent doesn't happen. For some reason, that education is locked into a situation where whatever you do has to be perfect immediately, and that there doesn't seem to be any general understanding of the public that, you know, maybe we could make an error and we go this way, we go that way. I've thought about that a great deal, and I guess the difference is that in science you have that leeway, but you're dealing with parents' most precious possession, I suppose, and I guess they don't want you to make any mistakes at all, but there ought to be some places or some kind of schools where we might be able to do that, similar to science.
Yeah, it's a case where, you know, when I do something, and when most people do something, it's trial and error. Sooner or later, you know, you're going to find that you can't do something right the first time, every time. And if you impress that upon the kids right from the beginning, that they have to get it right all the time, you know, that leads to frustration. What you're doing here is you're saying, look, it's okay to make mistakes if you're experimenting, if you're working on it. Sooner or later, you're going to have to think it through to come up with an answer. And that's okay. And if it's a case where you have to make a decision and the decision's wrong, okay, then maybe that will be a penalty or something like that. But the idea is that it's okay to make mistakes as long as they're in a pattern that's leading you to a better conclusion.
Yeah, I have the notion. Is that part of our feeling about the program, or do we inject that purposely, that the psychological feeling, the attitude of a school or a classroom is very important, and they are allowed to have that freedom of mistakes and to make mistakes, and they feel at ease? You know, if they're relaxed, it's really great. You can get that across, and they don't feel uptight all the time.
Exactly. It's a tough thing. You know, we're saying it's okay to make mistakes, but then everybody's striving to be perfect. So
Yeah.
it's a difficult line. I think the key is that the mistakes, if you want to talk about it, let's call them experimental errors. They're miscalculations. And the idea is you keep working on it until you work toward what you consider to be the right answer.
And of course, it's, I guess with many people, it's possible to fail, but from failure sometimes they learn other kinds of things. I wonder, we have a few minutes left, and I'm wondering if you would tell me a little bit, because I've been working with you on this and trying to get you some money for it. What does it look like in terms of the computers that we're bringing into the school system as they relate to science? So where are we there? We're in the infancy or just beginning? Or?
Well, we started to work with the computers in a 9th grade program that we piloted last year. We actually started to work with it just a little bit before that, at least in the thought stages. And where we figure the computer works best is in a situation where the kids can do an experiment, can problem solve, and then can use the computer as a tool. Too often, I think what happens is the computer is something that people are afraid of. And what we're trying to do is say, look, here's the tool, we'll show you how to work with it, and then what we want you to do is work with it so that it makes the task more reasonable, so that you can actually use it to go through and come up with answers.
We train a teacher first, right?
First step is the teacher.
Well, what is our program there? We talked about that, and
a lot of times it's actually on-the-job training. We have workshops. Frank Gardella and myself have tried to develop some techniques where we can get people to simply get used to the use of the terminal as quickly as possible. You find that once people get familiar with it, they can work with it, and it becomes very, very effective as an educational device.
It's not scary to them. Where did you get your experience? Just trial and error also?
About 2 weeks. 2 weeks before we started working with the teachers.
Well, I suppose that's good. But even that, sometimes you learn a great deal from just without any knowledge. So sometimes there's advantage when you just do it and you learn more. Sometimes if you have a lot of knowledge.
I have to tell you the truth. Actually,
well, why don't you?
Where I got most of my knowledge was from my son. The first time we got the terminal over at the school, I started to work with it and that, and I brought my son along the next time.
Tell you what we're going to do.
He straightened it out.
We're going to hire him. Well,
Okay.
thank you very much for watching and looking in on us. And we'll be back again. I think our next program will be in art. And Dr. Bonja, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I enjoyed the pictures very much. I think that's
Yes.
what we ought to do more of.
Okay.
Thank you very much and good evening.